The noble consciousness, then, is not related here to the object as an essence in general. On the contrary, what is alien to it is its own being for self. It finds confronting it its own but alienated self as such in the shape of an objective fixed reality, which it has to receive from another fixed being for self. Its object is a being for self, that is, its own being for self. But because it is an object, it is at the same time ipso facto an alien reality which has its own being for self, which has a will of its own. That is, it sees self in the power of an alien will on which it is dependent for possession of its own self. Paragraph 516 is nice and short and actually is pretty straightforward. There is some important stuff going on, but I think it's fairly easy to get through and to understand. It's really about the noble consciousness and its alienation from itself, as we're going to see play itself out in the paragraphs yet to come, now in terms of wealth as opposed to the state power. And he's not actually going to use this term Entfremdung that I have on the board here, alienation. Instead, he's going to use part of it, fremd, meaning alien, foreign, and he's going to talk about an alien will and finding one's own being for self alien to oneself. So he says that the noble consciousness is not related to the object, to the Gegenstand, right, that which stands opposed to it. It's not related to it as an essence in general. And the reason that I put wealth here is because in the last few paragraphs, we have made this transition to what shows itself as essence, that is wealth, right? And so it's not relating itself at this point directly to wealth. Instead, the noble consciousness is attempting to make sense of itself. And we saw that the noble consciousness really has two sides. The side that is engaged in service, that receives honor. There's a sort of transaction and identification with the state power there. And that side now finds its own being for self, its otherness, its irreducible individuality being given to it as an object. And here's where things start to get really strange, because up until this point, it's been the noble consciousness holding out this part of itself, its being for self, as a kind of stubborn, recess that it could keep entirely to itself. Even while it's engaging in service, this is how the ignoble consciousness is already there at the core of the noble consciousness. Now, instead, what we have been assuming is really the most inward, we're finding to be, in a certain sense, the most outward to the noble consciousness. It's conscious of its own self as being something alien to it. It could ask itself, whoa, what is going on here? Who am I in relation to who I thought I was? So he says, on the contrary, what is alien, fremd, to it is its own being for self. It finds confronting it its own, but alienated. Again, fremd, self as such. And he says, in the shape of an objective, gegenständliche, fixed reality, feste Wirklichkeit, something that remains the same. And this is a little strange here, because when we think of being for self, we tend to think of fluidity. We tend to think of negativity. We tend to think of this reflexive relation, not as being something that almost sounds in itself, a fixed reality, right? But that's what Hegel is saying here. It finds this confronting it. And here's where it gets very interesting. An objective fixed reality, which it has to receive from another fixed being for self. So where is this other being for self arising? Where are we going to find it? Is it from the state power? Is it from the unlimited or absolute monarch? No, in this case, it turns out that it is coming from wealth, or perhaps the rich. We have the introduction of a new element here, which also is for itself. And Hegel will talk about this here as being an alien reality which has its own being for self, right? It has a will of its own, but it sees itself in the power of an alien will on which it is dependent for possession of its own self. So that's how the passage ends. So what do we actually have here? The noble consciousness becomes cognizant of how in its own being for self, it is no longer just within the relation of itself to what constitutes it as noble, that is to the state power. It's existing as part of the economy. It's existing in relation to benefactors. It's existing in relation to another will. Self-consciousness can make abstraction from every particular aspect, and for that reason, even when it is tied to one of them, it retains the recognition and intrinsic validity of itself as an independent being. Here, however, as regards the aspect of that pure actuality, which is its very own, that is its own I, it finds that it is outside of itself and belongs to another, finds its personality as such dependent on the contingent personality of another, on the accident of a moment, on a caprice, or some other utterly unimportant circumstance. In the sphere of law, what is in the power of an objective being appears as a contingent content from which it is possible to make abstraction, and the controlling power does not affect the self as such. On the contrary, the self is acknowledged. Here, however, the self sees its self-certainty as such to be completely devoid of essence, sees that its pure personality is absolutely not a personality. The spirit of its gratitude is, therefore, the feeling of the most profound dejection as well as of extreme rebellion. When the pure I beholds itself outside of itself and rent asunder, then everything that has continuity and universality, everything that is called law, good, and right, is at the same time rent asunder and is destroyed. All identity dissolves away, for the utmost disparity now occupies the scene. What is absolutely essential is now absolutely unessential. Being for self is now external to itself. The pure I itself is absolutely disrupted. Paragraph 517 is longer than the preceding paragraph, and really the preceding paragraphs. And there's a bit more going on there, but it's really connected to the same themes, this fundamental split within self-consciousness. No longer the noble consciousness as such, but now self-consciousness. Because remember, the distinction between the noble and the base consciousness has been eroded in the process of the dialectic. There's this split going on. And why is that the case? Hegel tells us that self-consciousness can make abstraction from every particular aspect. And for that reason, even when it is tied to one of them, it retains the recognition and intrinsic reality of itself as an independent being. This is one aspect of its being for itself. It can recognize itself as an independent being. It can say, I am still who I am, regardless of what circumstances I fall into, regardless of whatever other people say, regardless of what my condition is. I am who I choose to be. Now, at the same time, he says, as regards the aspect of that pure actuality, which is its very own, that is its own I, it finds that this is outside of itself. Not only is there an alienation going on here, but notice what Hegel says next. It finds itself outside of itself and belongs to another. And I've done a little bit of playing on words here, right? An other. It belongs to the other. And who is the other? Somebody else who is not the self. Now, why would self-consciousness belong to the other? Well, remember here that we are still dealing with this dialectic of wealth and state power, and we're now looking at the side of wealth. What is it that wealth affords to us? The possibility for enjoyment and satisfaction. But more than that, the possibility of being. Wealth is needed to purchase what allows us not only to live a bare life of food and drink, shelter, some measure of safety, but all the other things that allow us to have our self-image, our who we are. So he goes on and he says, it finds that it belongs to another. It finds its personality as such dependent on the contingent personality of another. Now, why should that be the case? Well, I mean, let's think of some examples here. And all we need to do is pick a few, and this will really drive the point home. I'll take one that's particularly close to home. Why is it that I would create these videos? Well, it's because I want to explain Hegel and make all the... Well, that's dependent on even having the apparatus, we could say infrastructure of the internet that makes any of this feasible. I mean, when I first started reading Hegel, that's not what I was thinking about. The internet, I suppose, was coming into vogue to some degree, but it certainly didn't have the hold upon our life. It had not permeated actuality quite so much to where virtuality and actuality have become almost completely blurred together. It's because of something contingent. Right? And then why did I start doing Hegel in the first place? Well, my YouTube viewers, I took a poll and they said, we want Hegel and Sartre and Heidegger and Marcuse. I never actually did shoot any videos on Marcuse. Started shooting the existentialism videos. And then I started thinking maybe I should start shooting some things on Hegel. And it was a rather quixotic enterprise. I mean, Hegel is not the most popular philosopher, right? But it was feasible. And at a certain point, it took on a kind of life of its own, in which I am accountable not only to myself, but to a whole bunch of others. My viewers, my subscribers, the people who fund this project on Patreon. Think about all sorts of other aspects where people say, well, why did you do the job that you do? Well, it happened to be the one that paid the best at the time. The actuality that I am, in order to maintain the independence, the actuality demanded that I wear this uniform, that I behave in this way, that I clock in at this time, that I work from home, and we go on and on and on and on. There's so many cases where a person could have done so many different things if economic conditions, not even just economic conditions, if the personality of the people who make the decisions or who pay them or purchase things from them were a little bit different. That is contingency. That is what Hegel calls accident, Zufall, right? That is caprice, Willkür. This is a really interesting thing to point out. The other is not this totally fixed, oppressive, monolithic thing. It's all those people from whom we, at this point, derive this bit of our sustenance or our, way of supporting ourselves. At another time, the people who fund, the people who purchase, the people who bankroll, the people who organize, all of this sort of stuff. So he goes on and he says, the contingent personality of another, the accident of a moment, or a caprice, or some other utterly unimportant circumstance. There's a certain sense here of, when Hegel brings up, contingency, caprice, that sort of thing, of things not mattering so much anymore, or not having the meaning that they did. A kind of desperation or despair raises its head and may in fact set in. So he goes on and he says, in the sphere of law, this is by contrast. He's not saying that this is the sphere of law. He's wanting to give us a contrast to what was discussed earlier on in the reason section, or in the spirit section, in the very first part. In the sphere of law, what is in the power of an objective being appears as a contingent content from which it is possible to make abstraction. The controlling power does not affect the self as such, right? When we're related to each other in terms of law, we have sort of an outer shell, and we relate ourselves to each other that way, but the inner shell remains an independent being throughout all the transformations. That's not the case here. That's something different in this paragraph. He says here, the self sees its self-certainty as such to be completely devoid of essence. It no longer knows exactly who, and thereby what, it is. And is it going to identify itself with its contingent relation to other economic beings? If it does that, that could change. That seems very arbitrary. So he goes on and he says, what happens? It sees that its pure personality is absolutely not a personality. This is a deep alienation that Hegel is talking about here. So he goes on and he talks about the spirit of its gratitude. Why is it showing gratitude? It's showing gratitude for the fact that the other is providing it with its economic place, its purpose, its satisfactions. It shows gratitude. But then Hegel says this gratitude is sort of infected with something else. He says, the feeling of gratitude is the feeling of the most profound dejection as well as extreme rebellion. Nobody likes feeling themselves in the debt of others, feeling dependent upon them. Gratitude sometimes contains dejection, looking down, feeling like, oh, somebody else has to help me out. I don't have what I need. Or rebellion. You son of a bitch. You harnessed me. You made me do what you want. I'll show you gratitude, but it's not going to be real gratitude. It's going to be grudging. It's going to have some sort of sting concealed in it. These are two possibilities for a self that is in the process of dissolution. We're not really talking about the noble consciousness here anymore, are we? So Hegel goes on and he says, when the pure I beholds itself outside of itself and rent asunder, right? When the pure I beholds the I that is its actuality in relation to the other, in relation to wealth, what happens? Everything that has continuity and universality, everything that is called law, everything that is good, everything that is right, Hegel says, is destroyed, is rent asunder, is torn apart. This is the breakdown not only of the individual, but of the world of the individual, the moral world of the individual. So he says, all identity dissolves away. For the utmost disparity now occupies the scene. What is absolutely essential turns out to be unessential. Being for self is now outside of itself. The pure I itself is absolutely disrupted. What does this start to sound like? Have we seen this shape of consciousness before? Does this sound perhaps remotely like what was going on in, I don't know, the master-slave dialectic with the breakup of the slave and his or her personality and the reformation of it? Or does this sound more like what was happening in the skepticism part of Stoicism, skepticism and the unhappy consciousness? Or looking ahead, does this sound more like the world of law and the Lord of the world? Well, it's like all of them, except it's going a bit further now. This shakeup is going deeper. It's more concrete. Therefore, although this consciousness receives back from riches the objectivity of its being for self and supersedes it, it is not only like the preceding reflection, incomplete in principle, but is conscious of not being satisfied. The reflection, in which the self receives itself as something objective to it, is thus a direct contradiction lodged in the pure I itself. Qua self, however, it stands at the same time directly above this contradiction. It is absolutely elastic and therefore, again, supersedes this supersession of itself, rejects this disowning of itself, which would make its being for self into something alien, and rebels against this reception of itself, and in this very reception is conscious of itself. Paragraph 518 might come as somewhat of a surprise, given what the trajectory has seemed to be in the previous paragraphs, where first the noble consciousness had gotten revealed as not really being the noble consciousness because there's stuff going on in there that doesn't really seem all that noble, this being for self. And then we get self-consciousness, and it turns out that it's contingent on another, and that other really turns out to be wealth, Reichtum, here translated as riches. But the self-consciousness is going to have the last laugh here, and Hegel is going to talk in very interesting terms about what we might call an Aufhebung, a sublation, a transcendence on a higher level, because it's involving its own reflexivity. It is quite literally an Aufhebung of aufgehobene Seins, right? With the being, the superseding, the supersession of the self, the having been superseded of the self. This sounds really abstract. You might say, what is he talking about there? Well, what we're finding going on here is what Hegel has called at other points determinate negation, this process of the negation, yielding us something positive, but something new. Not merely the same, starting point, but a transformed one. So he says, although this consciousness receives back from riches the objectivity of its being for self, right? Which is nice. It gets, as we've seen, riches gives the being for self, which is outside of itself. It then transcends that or supersedes it. It engages in this process of sublation. It incorporates it back to itself, or it also says, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm still the self. But we saw that the self was, in the previous passage, sort of broke apart. All certainty was lost. All identity was lost. Yet it's going to come back now. So he says, it is not only like the preceding reflection, incomplete in principle, but is conscious. What is its consciousness of? Not being satisfied. The reflection, he says, in which the self receives itself as something objective, is a direct contradiction lodged in the pure I itself. A contradiction, a Widerspruch. A contradiction, no longer just a opposition, but a fundamental things being at odds with each other, as we saw in the previous paragraph. But now Hegel says that enables us to move past that. He says, qua self, it stands at the same time directly above this contradiction. It realizes the contradiction within itself, but it realizes that it's still there, realizing this contradiction. That there's, you might say, if we want to talk in meteorological terms, there is an eye to the center of the storm. Play on words there, right? Because we're talking about the I that says I, the I of identity. So he says it's absolutely elastic. And thereby, by being absolutely elastic, by being willing to depart from its old self and take on a new self, it supersedes the supersession of self. It raises Aufhebung to another level. Right? So he says it rejects this disowning of itself, which would make its being for self into something alien. That's what was happening in the previous paragraphs. Its being for self was turned into something alien, something foreign to it. So he says, and it rebels against this reception of itself. In this very reception, it is conscious of itself. It becomes conscious of who it is no longer is the old self, no longer is the self that's being just given to it arbitrarily, but is a self that is actually in revolt. A self that is not yet sure of who or what or even where it is, but who says, no, I am something, not just what you make of me, and not just what, contingency or arbitrariness would throw in my lap. I still can't say who I am, but I know that there is an I.